guys, how's it going? I'm Adam. I'm one of our shift brewers here at Newport Craft. Today we're going to talk about what comes after the mashing and the lautering, and it's going to be the boil. The boil is when we start using everyone's favorite ingredient they love to talk about, hops. That's what I've got here in front of me. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we use hops for and how they relate to the beer in the boil. So we talked about lautering. So now that we've got all of our wort, which is our grain sugar water, into our kettle, what we're going to do is raise that temperature to 212 degrees and have it reach a boil. We do a boil for a decontamination step to make sure that all of our wort that we have in there is going to be clean and sanitized. But we also do it to use hops to flavor it. So when we're talking about hops, there's a few things we want to look at here. We're talking about bitterness, flavor, and aroma. So that's what we gain from using hops. Historically, they used to use other things. Norwegians used juniper and things like that to add bitterness, because you want bitterness to balance out that malty sweetness of any beer. So when we're looking at hops, the way we can figure that out and measure those things is called IBUs. IBUs are perceived bitterness in a beer. You've probably seen it before. A West Coast IPA is going to have higher IBUs, lots more bitterness, whereas a New England IPA is going to be much lower on your IBUs, so it's going to be much less bitter. But both are still going to use lots of hops. So we'll talk a little bit about why those are different and how they're different if they're both using hops. So when we're looking at bitterness on a hop, we're looking at what's called an alpha acid percentage. So a hop with a higher alpha acid percentage is going to have a higher bitterness potential, whereas a hop with a low alpha acid percentage is going to have a lower bitterness potential. Now the way that we get that bitterness from those hops is called isomerization. So again, that circles back to why we boil the wort in the first place, is with that heat and that time that allows the isomerization of the alpha acids. So when we add hops early in a beer, when it's boiling, it's going to give more bitterness. As we go farther into it, it'll add flavor, and then finally it'll add aroma. So when you're adding, at the very beginning, you're going to add smaller amount. You get a lot more of that conversion, that full isomerization of hops, which is essentially those hops fully break down into that wort. As you get later, you're not going to have as much time over heat for those hops to isomerize. So some of those alpha acids are going to stay intact. So you're going to get flavor and aroma, but a lot less of that bitterness that you would from an early one. And then as you get later, it's going to trend more towards flavor, aroma, and then finally, everyone's aware of a dry hop, which is essentially when you add hops to a beer that is already fermenting. And that is going to give almost no bitterness, but it's going to give you a lot of flavor and a lot of aroma. Primarily aroma is what you're going to catch from it. So with those West Coast bitter IPAs, you're going to see some dry hopping, but you're going to see a lot more early hops. Whereas with your New England style IPAs, which are a lot less bitter, you're going to see a lot of hops shifted towards the end. So you're going to see them a lot more at the end of your boil. So they'll only see a boil for maybe a minute or more. And then you're going to see a lot more of the dry hopping as well. So when we're looking at hops, and less specifically when we're looking at our bittering hops, and we're starting to look at our flavor and our aroma hops, this is kind of a diagram that we've used before that I like to use sometimes in terms of trying to differentiate what sort of flavor and aroma notes you're going to get from a hop to kind of help you decide what direction, what hops, etc. that you want to do. So you're going to see it's kind of in a wheel. Now, no hop is going to necessarily be purely in one. It's kind of a swinging spectrum, so you're going to have a little bit more. You might have a lot of citrus notes, but you catch fruity and tropical and still have a little bit of resin. So we'll go over them real quick. So we've got citrus, resin, herbal, caddy, floral, fruity, and tropical. So citrus, obviously, a lot of times people think of citra hops. That's going to be one of the most popular ones you see a lot of times. You know, orange juice, oranges, things like that. Kind of moving along tropical, I like to think of pineapple, things like that. It's kind of still related to citrus, which is why they're close. Fruity, moving into more like stone fruits, things like that, apricot, plums, lots of peaches, lots of different things you can get with that. Floral, you're gonna catch it more in the nose. Sometimes, let's see, it's gonna be just kind of like not quite herbaceous, that's going to be a little more herbal. These two I find are related a lot of times, but floral, you just think like flowers, think fresh, think those like light little notes. A lot of times I think that more aroma, And then Caddy, so Caddy is gonna have a little bit of like some of those funky flavors you get in beer. Not usually a entire flavor, typically more of a contributing factor. Herbal, I always like to think lemongrass. That's one of my favorite notes that I get off herbal hops. So you're gonna catch a little bit more of those herbaceous kind of flavors rather than your fruity and sweet. So it's gonna be a little bit more towards that spectrum. And it's right beside resin, because resin is what you're gonna kind of get with those really, like a lot of times they can be bitter beers. Sometimes resin can be related to a little bit of a sharper taste, but resin is just gonna have that kind of like bitterness. You're gonna kind of feel it on your tongue that lingers for a while. And then we're back to citrus. So all of these kind of relate to each other. So one hop again is not totally one or the other, but these are different ways to kind of think about it. So when we're designing a beer, we're gonna look at what style of beer we want to create, and then we're gonna decide how do we want that beer to taste. Do we want to be traditional with the style? Do we want to do our own thing? And then we start to break that down, and then we look at these and decide what kind of hops we want to use. So as you can see here in front of me, we've got hops. So we've got what are called T90 pellets. So these are a hop that's compressed that are going to easily break apart, and when we add them to the beer. So for today, what we've used in our Save the Robots batch is going to be Citra, Mosaic, Galaxy, Amarillo, and Racal. So those are the 5 different hops that we use. We use a little bit on the bittering side, and then we use most of those are going to be late additions. So at the very end of our boil, we do what's called, we end the boil, we do what's called a whirlpool, which we use to basically, centrifugal motion causes everything to make a pile in the middle, but we start to cool the beer down just a little bit, and we add the majority of our hops at that point. What that does is the heat has backed off a little bit on the boil, so those hops that we add don't isomerize like what we were talking about earlier. So those alpha acids don't fully isomerize, which basically just means it doesn't add any bitterness, or very little bitterness rather. And so you're gonna get a lot of those flavors and all those tropical flavors and all the different notes that we want you to catch from those in the beer rather than it having that bitterness come through. Thanks again for watching me talk a little bit about hops today. Hope I was mildly entertaining. Stay tuned. Next time we're going to talk about the Whirlpool, the next portion, as well as chilling our wort and sending it to our fermentation tanks. So stay tuned and we'll see you then.